Professor Hitt is a distinguished university distinguished professor emeritus and a professor emeritus of management at Mays Business School, Texas A&M University. Professor Hitt received his PhD from the University of Colorado. There are a couple of people here who are happy about that. And has co-authored or co-edited 26 books and authored or co-authored many journal articles. If you look him up on Google, there are 129,000 citations. So all of you new PhDs, there's a goal for you. In fact, of course, a recent article listed him as one of the 10 most cited authors in management over a 25-year period. Professor Hitt has served on the editorial review boards of multiple journals and is a former editor of the Academy of Management Journal. Professor Hitt has a long relationship with the Army War College, having first engaged with War College faculty on an early version of the Strategic Leadership Primer back in the 1990s. His research now focuses on competitive advantage in a global context, highlighting the unique contribution of strategic entrepreneurship to create organizational value. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Michael Hitt. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thanks, Greg, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you, albeit virtually, but certainly a pleasure to be here and talk about this topic of strategic leadership. Let me kind of lay a little bit of the groundwork. You've already had some presentations. You had an excellent panel yesterday by Withers, Vera, and Pathak, who kind of laid out different perspectives on strategic leadership, particularly from the research perspective. And then you had an excellent discussion with Secretary Gates. And what my intent is to not go over the exact things that they did, but I hope what I provide is complementary to their comments. In fact, I'll refer to some of their comments, each one of them at different points in time. Where Withers talked about really kind of laid the framework for all of the research, or much of the research on strategic leadership. Professor Vera then talked about character and cognitive diversity and the effects of that on the outcomes of strategic leadership. And then Simantini Pathak talked about the context. And in fact, that will be some overlap with what I do, but hers is different, more specific, and I will refer to that work. And then, of course, Secretary Gates, talked about it, and there are actually some comments that he made that are very relevant to points that I will make today. Interestingly, we're not at any, we don't have a void of knowledge on leadership. In fact, there are some 15,000 books on leadership that are currently in print. So there's much. What we have to do is sort through that which is important and relevant for you and for us as we move forward thinking about strategic leadership. If you can move to the next slide, please. Next slide on that. There you go. Thank you. Now, I want to focus first on strategic context. Obviously, Pathak talked about context as well, but I'm going to take a little bit different bent, but it's complementary to what she said. A couple of years ago, as the pandemic became very significant in our daily lives, professional lives, and so on, I was asked by an editor if I would analyze what was going on with the pandemic, its effects on organizations, and what I might see for the future. Now, doing that, I had to do a lot of reading and thinking about the pandemic. I read about those that were doing some work on it. I invited a couple of co-authors, one from the US, one of my former PhD students, and then one from Europe with whom I've worked. So whatever we came up with was not just US specific, but had a more of a global perspective. And in that reading, one of the things that I came across was some work by Douglas North. Now, North is what's called an institutional economist, or he works in international economics. He's also a Nobel laureate, and so it caught my eye when I saw his discussion. It was about 20 years prior to when I was working on this. And he said, we live and operate in a non-ergodic world. Now, I have to be honest, I didn't know what ergodic world, non-ergodic world was, and I had to do some digging to understand that. But essentially, he said that after change, there's a new equilibrium achieved. Now, equilibrium, he's an economist, he thinks in those terms, and that it's dynamic and it never returns to the original conditions. Now, the term ergodic, I looked it up, tried to understand it, suggests that it's based in mathematical logic, and it suggests that all systems that change after some sustained period, the conditions return to a state similar to the original one. Whereas he says it's a non-ergodic world. In other words, the conditions do not return to the conditions they were before. In other words, we're in a new world. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute, but that's actually, while simple, actually a very important point to remember, I believe, for strategic leaders. Now, in this current non-ergodic world, it's already characterized by significant technological, socio-political, and institutional change, among others. I'm going to take a particular perspective on technology, go back in time just a little bit to give you a feel for this technological change. Now, again, you could see it yourselves in our everyday lives if you look back and over time. But I'll take one thing that's very prominent in both our personal and professional lives, and that is the cell phone. Now, going back in the earlier 2000s, we had several mobile phones, as we tend to refer to them at that time. There was the RIM BlackBerry, which was at one time one of the most popular mobile phones. Motorola Razr. There were entries by Nokia and by Samsung. And then about 16 years ago, almost within a few days, 16 years ago, within a couple of days, the new Apple iPhone was announced. Now, that represented a substantial change in that industry because the technology differed significantly from prior technology. And in fact, it changed that industry rather dramatically. And it changed our own professional lives as well. Now, just as a whole, so RIM BlackBerry, the Motorola Razr, Nokia, really are no longer relevant in that industry. Samsung is, but they developed the technology and somewhat imitating the work that Apple has done, and of course, continue to develop their own technology. So they're still highly relevant in that industry, but they're one of the only ones that was relevant back at that time. So that was a substantial change that changed the industry and changed actually both personal and professional lives, because it affected, as you know, a number of other industries and actions that we take, the way we communicate. Now, I just thinking 9 months ago, I purchased a newer version of the Apple iPhone. I've had several versions of it over time. But since that time, there's been another new version announced. So I think we're on version 14. So that's 14 after the original version was introduced. Now, the point is, if you take each version, it represents incremental changes or incremental changes in the technology. If we look at 14 versus the first one, it'd be pretty dramatic differences between the two. I haven't tried to compare them, but I know they are because I had a very early version, and the one I have today is quite significantly different and more sophisticated and has many more functions than the earlier one did. Now, the point is not to deal with that, just to put it in perspective, the technological change. That's one technological change in one industry that also affects both personal and professional activity. And the technology changes in many industries, and certainly you've seen it in the military as well. Sociopolitical, obviously, those are very relevant to you. What's going on in Ukraine, actions in China or by China, and Iran, and other places around the world that pop up at different points of time affect all of us. They affect the global markets, they affect political issues, political concerns, and therefore, obviously, your have special relevance for you. I'm not going to go into detail, but there are changes that come on a regular basis. Please move to the next slide. Next slide, please. Since 2000, we've experienced 3 highly disruptive events. Now, these are different from what I just described. The maybe even significant technological change or significant socio-political events, but these tend to be highly disruptive changes. There have been 3 that we've experienced, and they've been relevant globally. 9/11, a very sad day in our own history, and it had very significant effects and still having effects today. The 2008 financial crisis, and then the COVID pandemic. Now, these are highly disruptive events that tend to be cross country borders, they cross industry borders, they cross economic, political, and so on borders, and they have highly significant effects on us as strategic leaders. You know, if you're familiar with Fareed Zakaria, who is a political commentator, he wrote a book in 2020, published in 2020, that focused largely on the pandemic. Although he had other elements in which he brought to bear, but it was relatively focused on the pandemic and its effects. I've got a quote from that book. There are actually 3 parts to it. I'm going to read the quote, but then I'm going to take each part a little separately. There are decades when nothing happens. There are weeks when decades happen. As the worst passes, we emerge into the dead cold of tomorrow. The first part, there are decades when nothing happens. Actually, I disagree with that. I think he's trying to say there are decades when we don't have these highly disruptive events. But in fact, in the last 2 decades, we've had 3 highly disruptive events. And in preparation for the analysis that I did, suggests that we're likely to have, on a relatively regular basis, more of these disruptive events. It may be pandemic related, it may be other. But what I'm trying to point out is that these are not likely to be, they're likely to become more common, unfortunately. Now, I think he was making the point to really emphasize the second part when he says there are weeks when decades happen. And that's when you have these major disruptive events to which we have to adapt, and you have to adapt. You're in a leadership role. You have to adapt to these and/or in some way take actions that help you build the capabilities to respond effectively to these changes. The last part really relates back to the point I think that Douglas North was making, and that is we're in a new world. It's a new equilibrium, as he called it, where as the worst passes, we emerge into the dead cold of tomorrow, which means it's a unique context. The context is new, and we have to operate in that context, not as we did before, but as we need to meet the requirements of today. I cited Steve Colburn suggested that we can expect a prolonged period of instability and economic uncertainty. Honestly, I think any of us could make that statement. I just put it in because expect this to continue. Now, I've got a point down made by, in 2009, Mohammed El Arian suggested that the term, the new normal. Now, he is an American of Egyptian descent. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, and he, very young in his career, became CEO of PIMCO, which is a huge investment management company. And he saw it grow in size dramatically during his leadership. He then moved on from that, became a consultant, and he was an advisor to U.S. presidents. And he's currently the president of Queen's College at Cambridge. Now, the point is to tell you that the new normal, you've probably heard this term. A lot of people use that term today. If we go back to the point that Douglas North mentions, and he says a new equilibrium, essentially, it's the new normal. And I see this written, I see commentators using it very dramatically. We're in the new normal, but that new normal doesn't remain normal. It's only normal for a limited period of time. Okay, if we could move to the next slide. So we know that exercising strategic leadership is complex and challenging. We know that from the discussions. You know that probably already from discussions here and previously, from the discussions yesterday of the three on the panel, of the discussion from Secretary Gates. It does require a high tolerance for ambiguity, and certainly in this period of significant change, which is continuous or happens regularly, the individual has to have a strong self-efficacy. That means confidence without hubris or arrogance, but also a good sense of self. And I heard that come through in Secretary Gates' comments yesterday. You could also add to it some of the discussion that Professor Vera talked about yesterday in terms of character and the cognitive diversity. And we have to use a highly ethical approach, which fits the character notions that she talked about, and noted the effects and differences in outcomes of those that utilize, have character, and the character plays a role in their actions and decisions as strategic leaders versus those who do not. So in effect, strategic leaders have to envision the current environment. They have to envision, actually, if they can, the future to the extent it's possible. They have to use an entrepreneurial mindset because of this change, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. They have to develop and sustain an effective team culture, the team of individuals, people that they, in their unit that they're leading. And then they have to empower them to act. Now there's a part of that that I really thought was very well done by Secretary Gates in talking about decisions that are made. And I want to come back to that on the next slide. But you have to decide, but then you have to empower others to act. In other words, you're not the one as a strategic leader that necessarily implements those decisions. It's people in your team and people underneath you that will then take actions to implement whatever the strategic decision has been made. I want to use an example about the change and how people react to it. This is a business example talking about Procter & Gamble, which I'm sure all of you are very well aware of. It's a large multinational company. Back in the early 2000s, it was, and it has been over time, a highly successful organization, but the early 2000s, it was a very successful organization led by CEO of A.G. Lafley. He expanded into new global markets, expanded products and services, and was thought of as a highly successful CEO. In 2009, he made a decision to step back. He'd been CEO for a number of years and turned it over to a hand-picked successor, Bob McDonald. Now, McDonald essentially continued on Lafley's approaches and what he had done. The problem is the context had changed. We already noted the financial crisis of 2008, and it changed where the markets were smaller, they had shrunk, and there was a lot more competition. Competitors took different kinds of actions, and he was unable to respond to those actions, and therefore the stakeholders, and I say stakeholders, not just the stockholders, stakeholders lost confidence in his leadership, and then he resigned under pressure in 2013. So he was CEO for about 4 years. Not uncommon. Lafley was CEO longer. Lafley actually was brought back in for a period of time in the interim while they sought a more prominent replacement. So essentially, he can't continue doing what you did likely when the conditions changed. And of course, they changed dramatically at that time. And so it required a new approach and new strategies, and they needed to be implemented in probably different ways to deal with the competitors. Okay, next slide, please. Now, a point that's important, and I think it's important. I won't talk about research per se much, We've already had, you had the panel yesterday, and much of what they talked about summarized some of the research that's been done. Much of the research has been done. Obviously, they couldn't cover it all in a short period of time. But I want to make a point that strategic leadership is multi-level, And that when you make a decision as a strategic leader and you start implementing that decision, you have to take into account all of the context when making that decision, but then when it's implemented, it goes through all the rest of the organization, depending on the level, how far, all beyond. All units below have to help implement that decision. So leadership is influenced by the context beyond the unit and the team being led, both above and beyond, internal and external. And that comes through in Secretary Gates's books. I know you used some there at the War College, and it came through and if you listen to his comments, he didn't use necessarily the same terminology, but it was relevant in several of his comments. He talks about in his books about understanding the events that occurred, the key players that are involved, and you form your actions and make your decisions and form your actions based on all of the factors that are involved here. And he talked about that yesterday. I would note, and I think this is relevant, I'd like to just point out, obviously Secretary Gates was President Gates at Texas A&M when I was on the faculty there. And in fact, I had the pleasure and honor of working on I don't remember what we called it, but I'll call it a task force, a small group of the few faculty, few alumni or former students, and a few other administrators that served in an advisory capacity to him in the implementation of the strategies that were being employed. And I got to observe some of the things, I remember some of the things he talked about yesterday. But what I would say to you is that he is, and was, and is an excellent strategic leader. He's one of the best that I have ever worked for. I have worked in industry, and of course I've been in academia. He had some comments about leaders in academia, which I believe are relevant because most of them are not trained and prepared to take on the responsibilities they do. Much like in the military, you have a lot of training and experience, and you're developed to take on these roles. Unfortunately, it's rare in the academic world for that to occur. There are some excellent ones, and we were fortunate to have him there. When he left, I would say that every major stakeholder group, the alumni, the faculty, the students, were very sorry to see him go, even though he went on to a higher calling, and we were very supportive of his decision to move to become the Secretary of Defense. But I would say that his actions that he described are very relevant. What it also showed to me, given his discussions of the academic world as well as in the leadership roles he played in government and at the Department of Defense, is that strategic leadership moves. A lot of what we know about strategic leadership crosses the boundaries of organizations. Now, there are unique contexts. Professor Pathak yesterday talked about and noted some of the specific unique contexts of military. And of course, you know that well, but that would make it unique relative to others. But there's still a number of other factors about the strategic leadership that are highly relevant regardless of the organization. And one of those is that you always have to be involved and heavily with the stakeholders. Let me use an example again from Gates' discussion yesterday. Obviously, he talked about dealing with the senior officers and others, and he was mindful of their inputs. But he also talked about dealing with Congress. Those were external stakeholders and building relationships there that were relevant because they provided resources and support that were very important for the Department of Defense. Let me move to the next slide, please. Now, what I want to focus on are kind of a few elements. I'm going to focus on, for lack of a better term, a couple of dimensions of strategic leadership. You might refer to them differently. and then a couple of processes that I think are also very relevant in strategic leadership. These are not by all means everything, although the first two things, two dimensions or elements are very important in my opinion and highly relevant. First one is human capital. Strategic leadership, I think the most important element is human capital, the knowledge and skills of the individuals, both of the leader and of the people involved in the unit or in the team. So individuals and groups are the primary actors in organizations at all levels, And, if you again go back to I think it was the first question that was given to Secretary Gates. He talked about understanding the people and empathizing with the people and understanding them and working with them. I see that as very relevant to what we're talking about here in terms of the human capital, recognizing the importance of that and how it is managed. Now, there's a lot of research being done on particularly the leaders. I think there's even some that you're probably talking about in this conference. And Mike yesterday talked about, they had a list of number of different topics that have been examined about strategic leaders. I've got a few mentioned here in cognitive complexity, intellectual capabilities, the willingness and ability to learn, personality, which Mike also spent some time on and had a focus on. And there are others in terms of motives and so forth. Now, I'm not going to go through those because there's a lot of research on this. It's very important. It's not to downplay it. It's to suggest that that is relevant. We need more research on I'll call it the interaction of those leader attributes and the team's attributes. There is there's more there, but we need more to understand how these two interact. Let me make one other comment here. I would say to you that there are several summaries based on this. Withers had a good overview of this yesterday in summarizing the research that's been done. But I would also suggest that there's a work by Hambrick and Woolwick in 2021, which summarizes kind of the state of the work that's done on strategic leadership, Don Hambrick being one of the prominent leaders in this area, and then talking about what they see for the future. Now, Mike laid out a series of potential research topics that could add value to our knowledge of strategic leadership. But there's some excellent research questions there, those that are interested in the research. Hambrick and Woolwick also add some of that. They overlap with some of what Mike says, but also add other value. Let's go to the next slide, please. The other dimension that I consider highly relevant and important is what's sometimes referred to as relational or social capital. Now, all we're talking about here is the relationships with the team. So you have a relationship with the team and with other stakeholders, both internal to the organization and external. And very, very important. I draw on, I'm not going to go into this, I'm going to draw on research by Brian Uzi, who is a sociologist, and talking about what he uses the term relational embeddedness. I don't want to talk about that. I use the term relational capital because I consider it an important resource. And he suggests that the number one criterion is building trust among the group, whatever the group is. If it's within the team, if it's across teams, across organizations, you have to build trust so that knowledge and information is shared among those individuals, and that adds value where you can make better decisions. And he suggests then you would engage in joint problem solving. That's not always true, but you would engage in problem solving to the extent that you gain the inputs from them. Again, I'll refer to Secretary Gates's discussion about being decisive, making decisions, being decisive. And yet you note that he suggested he listened to those on his team, even those that didn't have the same view that he had at the time. And sometimes he changed his view and moved toward those that had a different view. That would be where you engage others, you use the knowledge and information from the whole group, where there's trust in doing that, and then you come to a better decision. It involves significant communication and coordination, and it again comes back to building the relationships, both internal and external. Please move to the next slide. As a part of this, I want to focus on a process now. You've got the two, you can refer to them as resources, if you will. I'll come back to that in a minute. But as a strategic leader, you are managing a resource portfolio. It may be a resource portfolio of some hard dollars, some other equipment, but it also entails people and relationships. And you've got to put together, think about your resource portfolio in the context of what's needed. And because this resource portfolio, you're trying to have the necessary resources to build the capabilities that you need to address the either your charge, your objectives, and or the changes in the environment. Now, I would suggest that much of the resources that are most critical for you in this regard are intangible. Now, there was a question, Secretary Gates yesterday, I thought an excellent question, actually, suggesting that many times there's a focus on hard skills rather than soft skills, and you got to, the performance outcomes are very dramatic, and you have to satisfy those outcomes. That's not uncommon in business as well, where the focus is on the hard outcomes, the actual financial outcomes oftentimes, but it's not always that, but they focus on that. But I would suggest that there's some research that's been done, and this is by accounting and finance types, that suggests that 60 to 70% of the value that occurs from the work that's done in an organization or by unit comes from intangible capabilities. Now, in a business, the two prominent intangible capabilities are human capital and relational capital or relationships. But there are also some other other types of intangible resources that may not be as relevant to the military, such as brand equity, patents, and so on. But there may be other types of intangibles. The issue is, of the research I've seen, and this goes beyond what I just cite here, suggests that most of the value that's created in organizations comes from intangible resources. And therefore, the way you manage those resources becomes extremely critical to the outcomes that you achieve over time. And again, I'll refer to Secretary Gates's responses to suggest he focused, as noted by the person who developed this question, largely on what was referred to as soft skills. I'll just call it intangible skills and capabilities. Now, the second process that I consider very important and that sometimes is overlooked, we talk about developing the right strategies. And this happens in business, it happens in all kinds of organizations, trying to develop the strategy that's going to gain an advantage over whomever, your competitors or the others you're working against. To do that, we not only have to have an excellent strategy, we have to implement that strategy effectively. And I would say that in businesses in particular, one of the things that sometimes is overlooked is the implementation of those strategic decisions. And how is that done? Well, it actually does start with the strategic leaders. It starts with the strategy, but then the implementation of that strategy starts with the strategic leaders, often at the top of the organization, but it works through the whole organization. All units, all strategic leaders at each level have an impact on and help to implement those strategic decisions. If they do not, if they do it poorly, or if they don't do it well, then that decision, that strategy won't work. And the strategic decision, even though it may have been formed appropriately, it's not going to be effective. And therefore, it has to be handled. So that requires a lot of coordination, exploiting capabilities, and in fact, dealing with, again, the stakeholders, both inside the organization in this case, sometimes externally, because you may need resources or other cooperation from other major stakeholders outside the organization in order to implement your strategy well. Please move to the next slide. Now, we've talked about the changes in the environment. I started with that. I want to come back to that as we kind of move toward the end. As you're trying to develop this portfolio of resources and continuously manage it to deal with the environment, you have to manage change. That's essentially what you're doing. You have to manage change to fit the environment and the context in which you're operating. There's a term, this is an academic term, dynamic capabilities. It was developed by David Teese, who was and is a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. I first was acquainted with that term in an article that he wrote with a couple of others in 1997. He's continued on with that, and at least in the academic world, and in some others in the practice world, has become relevant, talking about dynamic capabilities. What is dynamic capabilities? It essentially, very simply, is the ability to change in effective ways to deal with the context as required. You're changing the capabilities that you have, allowing you to either adapt to the context or, in some cases, create the context. Now, David talked about sensing the environment, understanding it, and seizing opportunities that exist there. Kathy Eisenhart, who's a professor at Stanford and has done a lot of work both crossing the organizational world, both in academia and business, talks about exploring or shaping opportunities. And that's creating the context. Let me go back to one of the examples I used in the beginning, talking about technology. Apple and the iPhone, introduced the iPhone. It created the context. The change that occurred to all the other competitors in that industry was created by Apple. In fact, interestingly, during the first decade of the 21st century, Apple introduced products that dramatically disrupted and changed 3 different industries, this being one of them. So you can create the context. It's not the common approach, because much of the approach is going to be adapting to that context, but there may be times when you can create that context. It will often entail reconfiguring the capabilities that you have and or regenerating resources and capabilities, and possibly creating new capabilities. And you have to be cognizant of that. So just like I talked about the resource portfolio, you're constantly involved in acquiring and developing resources and capabilities, and those may be changed based on the needs and requirements of the environment in which you're operating. Another term, and it's an academic term, meta capabilities. And again, it's a pretty simple notion. We talk about a capability, whatever the capability is. A capability is what we call a first order capability. Dynamic capabilities are what we call second order capabilities, because you're changing the capabilities in some way that you have. Meta capabilities is the ability to develop dynamic capabilities. Now you may say, well, this is that's a third order capability. That is getting kind of out of hand. Well, in point of fact, it's a mindset. But in fact, if you're a strategic leader at a relatively high level, you've got multiple units and strategic leaders under you, what you have to do is ensure that they have the ability to make changes and they have dynamic capabilities in order to change the capabilities that they need to operate effectively. Rather than you don't change them at the top, you help them develop and maintain their own dynamic capabilities so that they can change and adapt those capabilities as needed. So there are kind of three levels of that. Let me use a couple of examples now. Again, going back to these disruptive events, just we don't have to talk about them in all the cases, but they are highly relevant. And I talk about Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard was and still a very relevant and important company in the high-tech industry, but at one time it was one of the high-tech leaders. Highly innovative, introducing new products and new technologies on a regular basis. Over time, for whatever reason, the leadership changed and the innovative culture was lost. And then it reached a point where, in fact, it had significant problems trying to respond to the competitors, and especially given the 2008 crisis that occurred, which changed markets and global markets, HP started suffering dramatically. So the board decided that there was need for change, and a change in the leadership of the company. And they, as happens a lot in business, they the current CEO resigned, in quotes, under pressure, and then a new CEO was hired. This CEO was Leo Apotheker. Now, I don't wish to be unkind, but I don't think he really fit their needs, given his background, etc. But neither here nor there, he took over. He recognized that they had a significant problem because they were behind in the technologies and in the products that were being offered relative to their competitors, and he had to seek some way to change. You don't develop, redevelop, or reinstitute a innovation culture and make changes dramatically that will lead to short-term results. So what he decided to do is he was going to go out and acquire technologies, and he would acquire essentially companies, businesses that had technologies that he thought would add to their current product and technology base. So within a very short period of time, he made like 3 acquisitions. They weren't successful because there were a lot of problems in making acquisitions and integrating them into a company anyway. And he wasn't very effective in what he did. He knew this is what they needed in the short term, but they were not effective. And honestly, within 11 months, he was asked to resign, and Meg Whitman, who was on the board at the time, became the CEO and started, in a sense, righting the ship, but it took time. So there is a reaction, there's a response to a major event. They were already suffering, they already had problems. Those problems were exacerbated greatly because of the disruptive event of 2008 financial crisis, which had a major effect on global markets where they operated, and they were not able to compete effectively. Already were behind, and they became further behind. The next point is a little bit different. It has some positive, some negative. A company that you well know, Amazon. Amazon was already, before the pandemic, was already in the process of changing pretty dramatically the retail industry, and working through its online service of offering products of all types. It's kind of, one time, a number of years ago, it was referred to as the Walmart of the online services, but it's become a major competitor of Walmart and any brick and mortar retailer. But during the pandemic, they were almost in the right place at the right time. You say they already had the strategy because people couldn't or didn't visit the retail outlets, so they ordered more online. And here's where they were able to ramp up very quickly. They were already in the process of doing so. So strategically, they were doing the right things. They had built and developed significantly the technology of ordering and providing the delivery services, even using some very sophisticated technology. They were building very large distribution warehouses, often located close to major metropolitan areas, so they could respond very quickly to needs and orders that were made. So they strategically, they were doing probably a lot of the right things that helped them respond effectively during the pandemic. And in fact, their business expanded greatly during that time. They earned significant returns. The disadvantage in the problems is they didn't deal with the human element well. And they're paying the price somewhat of that. Of course, they're now coming back because things have changed. There's a new normal, but it's not so dependent on the online systems. But they didn't handle the human element well in the wrap up, and they're paying a price for that today. So I don't want to offer it as a perfect example. It obviously gives you both the strategy and what really worked, but there are parts of it that didn't work, and in the long term, they're going to suffer significantly unless they're able to right that ship. If we can move to the next slide, please. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. One is I'll call it a quasi quote from the work that I did that goes back to the point when I started trying to analyze, along with others, the effects of the pandemic on organizations, on markets, and on what would occur after the fact. Essentially, I'm going to read it to you because there's some relevance here. You can read it too, but there is a new world order where countries are more parochial. And this has very significant relevance beyond just economic that might have. And the distribution of economic power is dynamic. It's changing. If you look at different places across the world that have become more prominent, stronger, some becoming less prominent, that affects then the interactions of the governments, and obviously may even have relevance for what you do. And there's greater access to knowledge and higher velocity of information across all parts, which used to that there was holding economics, holding the knowledge and information gave power. Today, it's widely distributed, much easier access, and therefore others have access to it as well. And all of this, along with other factors, contribute to a highly dynamic and uncertain environment, which all of us have to deal as strategic leaders and have to, again, engage in continuous development of our capabilities to ensure that they fit the needs and requirements as we go forward. Let me end, though, with maybe I'll call it a more positive note. Again, go back to the book by Zakaria, and in this he suggests that history has shown that creativity and ingenuity are often enhanced in challenging times. Now, what that suggests is there's opportunity available for those that are more creative and use the ingenuity. They are probably able to navigate more effectively in these changing times and changing environments, as well as maybe even in creating the environments that they want. Well, I hope that I've given you some ideas. I've talked about change being very critical and your ability to adapt to that change and focused on the capabilities that you have. I hope that it adds to what you've learned in your other sessions, as well as the two major sessions yesterday. And I'm open to any questions that you have about this presentation or any other that may be relevant or related to our points.
Professor Hitt, thank you. Thanks very much. We've got a couple questions online. Let's start with one of those, if you would, please, Trent.
Okay, sir, this is Colonel Trent Hutton, Go Buffs.
Okay.
I would like to start. I would like to start with a question from our own Steve Garris, Dr. Steve Garris. He's asking, can you describe the leadership Venn diagram, and specifically, how much overlap is there between the requirements of strategic leadership with the lower levels of leadership?
All right, that's a good question. Here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to take kind of the back end of this. I actually believe that strategic leadership is relevant at almost all levels. And I think others do as well. Obviously, it's highly relevant at the top of the organization and at high levels. But I actually believe that many of the characteristics and attributes that we talk about as strategic leaders are relevant even at the lower levels. So they may have less discretion, less there's lower ambiguity of action, what needs to be taken, but they still have to manage the human capital. They still have to build relationships that we've talked about. And so I actually believe that you can have strategic leadership at almost any level in the organization where leaders exist and have units of responsibility and people working with them. So in that regard, I believe that it's relevant at all levels. It becomes even more relevant and significant as we move up. Just again, going back to Secretary Gates and Department of Defense, talks about the actions that he took. But as you go down that organization, still a lot of the actions that need to be taken to even implement the decisions that some of which he mentioned yesterday, it still requires leaders to take actions, get people on board, to use the capabilities to make those work in an effective way.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for your comments and your time today. My question is in reference to leadership models. Many of our leadership models, of course, you know, with how they were developed, did not take into consideration, of course, everything that's going on because it was just unknown. So how do you feel our current leadership models can actually, I guess you can say, fit the modern context that is needed today? Or do you feel that they are archaic and we need to review what we have as our traditional leadership models?
That's actually a very good question. I believe for some time in talking to leadership scholars that some of the models, they're not irrelevant. They tell us something, but again, many of them don't take into account the context. Sometimes it's the specific context of the type of organization, as Professor Pathak talked about yesterday in terms of the military, for example. But it's also the context, broader context that I mentioned today. I think that we have to take these into account. And so what I really believe is that we're going to have to examine some of the more important or the relevant, better models, if you will, in terms of incorporating the context. That's why I mentioned earlier, although in brief, that we really are multi-level. You have to take into account the context and the leadership within a unit, et cetera. And much of the research of which I'm aware, well, I won't say much. There's still some, but not a lot of research takes that into account. Certainly not in terms of the specific models that we're talking about. Not that those are irrelevant. I think that they added value at a point in time. It's kind of like I mentioned that the context changes. It's changing now. When those models were developed, it's what we knew. I look at the early work that Don Hambrick did on what's now referred to as strategic leadership. He did this back in the 1980s. It started with Hambrick and Mason. I believe it was published in 1984. And when he was talking about the relevance of leaders, he was focused on top executives in business organizations, but talking about, then they started by looking at their attributes. And Mike listed several of those yesterday. Their functional experience, which is relevant. Their other tenure with the organization, their risk propensity and so forth, and how that affected the decisions that they make. And what he looked at were, in this case, the strategies and then the outcomes. Since then, there's been a lot more work done looking at more of the psychological attributes, not looking at just the physical or other attributes of motivations, the personality, and so on, and helping us to better understand that certain types of personality make better leaders. For example, narcissists generally don't make very good leaders. Again, but there are others that do. So we learn, but we also need to understand this within context. And I would argue that research we need a lot more research in that to understand that both in your organization, but in all organizations. So again, all I can say is I don't think that those models are irrelevant, but we need to do more to understand their relevance and what adjustments we might have to make or put them in context. And so that context becomes very critical.
Sir, this is Colonel Hunton again with another question from chat. And this might be able to put a little bit more nuance to what you're saying. And that is a question from Chuck Allen, Professor Chuck Allen. And this is a question he posed to Dr. Gates yesterday and now to you. And what are the differences you see in the nature of strategic leadership for military context versus the civilian or corporate contexts and their domains? Do they matter, and to what extent?
Well, first I would say they do matter. Yes. I'm not an expert in the military context. I have served many years ago, but I have had interactions with and understand a little bit about the military context. I know a lot more about the business context, but I do know, one, there are certain factors that are less relevant. The amount of managerial discretion, and that doesn't mean that that's bad, but it's different. There's not one better than the other. It's just that there are different contexts. Professor Pathak, I think, listed a number of the characteristics yesterday of military organizations. And their danger, there are other factors that are less likely to occur in business organizations that occur in military organizations. The risk is different oftentimes. Not always, but the risk is different. So there are differences in the context, and those do matter, and they have to be taken into account in terms of the decisions that are made. Yet, a lot of what is relevant, in my opinion, still matters. And that is, again, going back to Gates's, since we related to Gates, he talked about people. He talked about the decisiveness, how he utilizes inputs from those that work with him and for him. And I saw his ability to move from an academic world, from a government world, a government job and leadership, to an academic world, back to a very prominent leadership role in the government. And he carried forth many of the same actions as a defense secretary, based on what he said, that I saw him use when he was the president of Texas A&M University. That doesn't mean, again, he wasn't sensitive to the context. Context does differ across those two. I think he was sensitive to it, but he paid attention to those that gave him advice. He talked about even examples where he listened to those where he didn't even initially agree, but then listened and took into account their inputs and utilized that. Of course, he already had a lot of experience with the government service and dealing with in the intelligence area, et cetera. In the academic world, he didn't have that much. He had a PhD, but he didn't have a lot of experience in the academic world, and yet he was extremely successful in that world, where others are less successful. So all I would say is there are certain characteristics of strategic leadership that go across, but the contexts do differ, and those have to be taken into account by those in the leadership cast. I don't see them as dramatically different, but they are unique, and those have to be considered within that context.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There we go. Hi, Dr. Hitt. Thank you very much for speaking with us today. I'm Allison Abbey here at the Army War College. We've had Chief of Staff of the Army, General McConville, here to talk to the students, and he's fond of saying that leaders should trust their instincts, but only if they have instincts. So I'm just wondering from you, how do leaders best recognize when a discontinuity is occurring, and thus their instincts or their expertise might not really apply this in the same way as it did in the previous context? Over.
All right, that's an interesting but an important statement, and the question is also a good one. You know, I think the discontinuity, it's not easy necessarily to identify, but you know, you think back, if you talk, well, there are two types of discontinuities. One is the highly disruptive events, like I mentioned, identified the three. Those you can expect that those are likely to be important, and that creates a discontinuity. You're less likely to know when other kinds of changes occur of being able to identify. And I'm going to use this as an example. Going back to one that I used. Now, this is a business example, not a military example. But when Apple introduced the iPhone, that could have been, that technology might not have succeeded. So the BlackBerry, frankly, the Razor, the others didn't respond initially to that change. Now, it probably would have been difficult for them to respond to in the short term, but they didn't, and eventually went out of business, and they really needed to find a way to respond. Samsung, on the other hand, was able to adapt and respond, and has remained as a major competitor in that industry. So I think those kinds of changes are more difficult to identify as a discontinuity. You know, the one point that I didn't make to you, but is, I think, still highly relevant today, and that is that there's going to be other technological changes that are going to occur in the near term. Actually, they're actually occurring today, that I think military as well as business leaders are going to have to consider how that affects what you do, and take that into account, and how you adapt your capabilities to the changing technology. I'll mention one. I know less how it would exactly affect the military than I know business, but artificial intelligence. You know, within about 2 days ago, Microsoft announced a $10 billion investment in a newer, relatively new startup called OpenAI, Open Artificial Intelligence. You say, well, why that one? Google had bought a company, going back 6-7 years, that dealt in artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence has been around a long time, but the capabilities in artificial intelligence are really ramping up significantly. I know at least a little bit that it's affecting some of the hardware that you're using in the military. You would be able to assess that more than I, and in the future going forward, I expect it will have major potential effects. It certainly will in industry, just the things that they're talking about in AI. By the year 2030, we're going to see substantial changes in our personal and professional lives affected by artificial intelligence in a whole variety of different ways. Hopefully all good, but probably some maybe not so good. Just to give you a feel, the CEO of this OpenAI will be on the cover of the next issue of Fortune magazine, again, suggesting the importance of not only this company, but that particular technology. So I would say to you that technological changes, and possibly and likely that you would be a better judge than I of some of the socio-political changes that are going on across the world, are likely to require they're going to create some discontinuities of which you'll have to respond, both as a leader and your organization will have to respond. So again, a good point. I don't know that I have the perfect answer, but I can tell you that I fully expect that you're going to see and need to respond to some discontinuities. Some of those should be positive, but will require you to develop, either use your instinct to develop new capabilities and work with others. And I guess that you're not going to be totally alone, except you're going to be working with others in this regard, trying to identify that.
Hey, good afternoon, Dr. Hitt. I'm Colonel Tim Book. I'm an instructor here at the Army War College. Thank you for a great presentation.
Yes, sir.
This morning, we had a healthy discussion on the use of assessments to help us guide the educational experience for our students. My question revolves around, what is the business world using to guide the development experience for future CEOs or the business world to make sure that they have a tailored experience for their students going forward? Thank you.
All right, that's actually a very good question. I would tell you it varies greatly within the business world. You know, again, Gates spoke to this a little bit in a different way. He noted that, and he was comparing, I think, academia and the military in terms of the preparation that people receive, this say for leaders in key positions, and that there's very little. I can say this from a business standpoint because I know a little bit about it. There are a few companies that do this well, and they do a lot of things that are fairly similar to what I know about the military in terms of development programs, focusing on skills, placing people in different positions to gain experience and knowledge, broader knowledge, both maybe if they're a global company in different cultural contexts, but also in different parts of the business so they understand them, so that when they become leaders at higher levels, they can better understand what needs to be done, the processes that are involved, and make decisions based on that knowledge and experience. But a lot of them don't. And I gave some examples today where selections were made. I can't speak to I have to go back and look at what they did in terms of development. The first one that I mentioned was Procter & Gamble. Now, in that case, the person who was chosen as CEO understudied the current at that time the current CEO, and knew the strategies and policies that had been successful. Problem was the context changed, and so you couldn't apply the same as you did in the past. Somehow we have to place people in positions so that they are better able to understand when and how changes need to be made, and that's probably the biggest problem that I see in business. We kind of wait till it occurs and then try to figure it out. And that's why a lot of businesses suffered greatly during the pandemic. Few did not. Few were able to navigate it well. And I would say to you, I know a little bit about what's done in the military. You know more, but I would suggest that any way we can place people in positions where they at least engage challenges that help them understand the need to make changes and the kinds of changes that need to be made will help them as they move up the ladder into higher level and very prominent strategic leader roles.
Sir, John Gentiloni here. Thanks for speaking to us.
Yes,
I've
John.
got a question about character. So one of the comments that Secretary Gates yesterday made generated a good bit of discussion. So paraphrasing, he remarked on the importance of early character formation, stating that if you don't have it by the time you join up, the military won't give it to you. And I'm wondering if you'd mind sharing your thoughts on the importance of character and perhaps the organization's ability to influence character.
Okay, that's I remember that his response, and I agree partly with him. It's probably one of the few times that I would not fully agree with Secretary Gates because, as you know, I have a high respect, a high regard for him. I do agree that character is formed oftentimes early in your life, but I also have seen cases, individually and otherwise, where people were able to better understand and adapt, where they maybe came out of a pretty bad life where they weren't given the kinds of character development that many of us had the opportunity to have, but were able to change and adapt. I think some people can be changed, and I think organizations can help people develop character. May not always be the right term, but they can help them understand the importance of how character and the decisions that are made affect them and others. And that's where it gets into, I use the term, as I briefly mentioned, taking an ethical approach. They don't always do that, and there are times that people have gone past that, and maybe they're motivated by other things. But as a whole, if you can help people understand, I think there are times you can help people change and develop greater character. That doesn't mean everybody, and that you can help them see the importance of taking an ethical approach, and over time, what that can do. A strategic leader, if you have trust of the people that work with you and for you, if you continue to take this approach, that trust will only build. If you don't, the trust will fall away. You know, he used an example where people often say, or he thinks, and I have heard this too, people that say, I want to hear what you mean, even what you think, even if it doesn't agree with me, and yet they don't really mean it. And he suggests that people are reticent then. That means there's a lack of trust there. If they mean it and they continue to act on it, they're going to build that trust, and then they'll get those differing opinions, which will help them. Maybe sometimes, I consider, going back to a point made earlier, talking about the instinct, it is individualized, but it's also, I see it group-wise. You know, again, Gates talked about a decision he made that he was going to make, but then he changed his mind based on the inputs that were received. And that instinct may not have been the right term, but he in fact listened to those that worked with him and accorded them respect, and frankly, not just respect, but they changed his mind in terms of the importance of making that change. So I do agree that most of us have value sets and our characters formed early in our lives, but there are people that don't have that opportunity, and that I believe can be changed. And so I think there are some opportunities that we can have both organizationally and as we work with others to help them see the value of being ethical and having strong character in the actions that they take.
Professor Hitt, Craig Bullis again. Let me just say thank you. You have engaged with us at the Army War College for decades, and you continued that again today. You provided us an integrative framework and a challenge that incorporates many of the concepts, many of the discussions that we've had both formally and informally during this week. And for that, we appreciate it and we thank you very much. I'd like to leave the last word for you, sir.
Well, I'd just like to say it's really a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person. I had a slight accident that disallowed my travel right now, but I'm glad that we had the opportunity to do this virtually, and I hope that what I've provided at least provides food for thought for you as you move forward as strategic leaders. What you're doing is very important and valuable to all of us, and we thank you for it. And it's my pleasure to play a small role in helping lead this very important strategic leadership development forum. Thank you very much for allowing me to do that.
Thank you, sir. Enjoy the rest of the day.